2020 was a good year during that COVID year for the markets, and in particular for renewable stocks. The train that renewable energy is on is not going to stop. It will, gradually take over from fossil fuels to the point where, the energy markets will change.
I am here with Dave Callaway. He is the former editor-in-chief of USA Today, former CEO of TheStreet.com, former editor-in-chief, I believe, of MarketWatch as well, and the founder of the newsletter, Callaway Climate Insights, to which I am a paying customer and have been for a long time. Dave, welcome.
Great to be here. Good to see you, James.
So we talked before, and you're one of the nicest guys around, and I appreciate that because there are some less nice guys. So it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And we like when good things happen to good people. But looking back, I recall your newsletter starting like right as COVID was happening. And, the big story was COVID. And I was like, wow, he's really got some chutzpah here starting this newsletter like right at this time. But you did it and you kept with it. How are things going?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I thought, like everyone else, COVID was going to last a few weeks. What did I know? Right. So I started the newsletter anyway. But COVID, like everything else, turned into a climate story in many ways. Right. We saw the lockdowns and the shutdowns, and we saw, this rebound in nature around the world and animals coming back into cities and stuff. And it really showed the positive impact of creating a world that's less polluted with less energy use and less people kind of, transportation traffic. So it did turn out to be a good time. And 2020 was a good year during that COVID year for the markets, and in particular for renewable stocks. Everyone was on the bandwagon of the so-called ESG fad. And, the problem is that's what it kind of turned out to be, is more of a fad than anything else. And, once the stocks started to get hot and we saw a lot of money going into them, we saw the environmental reasons behind it, Wall Street started churning out products and people jumped on board. And like we've seen, like you and I have seen over the decades, James, these things don't always work out. Crypto and real estate back in 2007, 2008, collateralized mortgage obligations, CMOs. So it did turn out that ESG back then in 2020 was more of a momentum play. But I remember, and you remember, the early days of the internet back in 99 and 2000. When there was also a lot of momentum at stake. And if we go back and we look at a lot of those companies, 90% of them are gone. Some of them, like Amazon, even Yahoo, have managed to stick it out. Google and Twitter came afterward. So, what happens in technology, and we're starting to see this as the AI fad develops in the markets with sky high PEs on companies like NVIDIA and AMD. What happens in these fads is all the money rushes in, prices go up, some money's made, a lot is lost. The fast money moves somewhere else, and the sectors left behind are left to clean up and consolidate. And then you have the emerging winners. And I've no doubt we'll see those in renewable energy going forward.
Interesting. And I'm glad you have faith. I mean, as Charlie Munger says, you show me the incentive and I'll show you the behavior. And I think Wall Street often works like that. But to your point about that histogram, right? I mean, U.S. has had 2,400, something like that, car companies come and go. And now we've got just a couple. We had 900 e-commerce companies in the 1990s. Now we've got Amazon and maybe eBay, right? And 17,000 crypto coins a couple of years. I don't know how many crypto now, but it's same thing with anything new, with AI especially. Let me drill down a little bit, because ESG has been in the public forum for the past couple of years. In particular, it was all the rage. Then you could argue that after Putin invaded Ukraine, energy was suddenly in the fore, and so were weapons. You had Citigroup, you had the EU, I think, Commission on Sustainable Financing, basically flipping and saying, guns are used to be bad, but now guns are good if they're used to defend us. And you had Tesla getting kicked out of the S&P ESG index, while I forgot some tobacco companies remain. So it's very, or ExxonMobil remains. So it's very complicated, and there are a lot of accusations. I think some of them are well founded, of hypocrisy. my first question to you is, has your perspective on ESG changed over the past few years? Just starting with what's literally ESG, and if so, how?
It's a good question. I think the momentum behind the push into ESG, the renewable energy transition away from fossil fuels, the cleaning up of the carbon footprints of major companies has not changed a bit. I think a lot of executives are still behind that. Behind it, we saw, just last week, Walmart announced it's 6 years ahead of cutting of its goal to cut its emissions in half. Other companies like Salesforce and Google are cutting emissions. There's a lot of that going on. Renewable energy is soaring. Solar energy is soaring. Wind has had some problems, and I think what we all misjudged, myself included, back in 2020, was that a lot of these companies, which are large, which require large amounts of hardware and infrastructure to work, had a lot of debt, and so they were interest rate plays. And when rates turned, a lot of people were left exposed, and that was especially the wind companies, some of the solar companies. So, long way of saying that I think the push to move away from fossil fuels and reduce carbon footprints is still there. I think the mania over ESG, the term, and the stocks that claim, that rode that term, has ended, and part of it was the fact that the stocks fell. A lot of credit is given to the red state politicians and DeSantis and Abbott and stuff in Texas, and fighting ESG and embarrassing Wall Street and threatening to take away business from BlackRock and J.P. Morgan and Barclays. They made a lot of noise, and it certainly has had an effect. And with BlackRock in particular, you've seen them pull back. But that, more than anything, it was the downturn in the stocks that soured on investors on ESG.
Yeah. And without taking political side, I mean, some of those voices are quite vituperative, politically speaking, and I was rather surprised at some of them. And you could argue also that it's just interest rates, right? The Federal Reserve raised rates, and if you have a small company, let's say it's a clean tech, or it could be something else, a biotech also, where your cash flows are expected to come far into the future, the higher the interest rate, the more penalized those cash flows are in a DCF, discounted cash flow model sense. So just the raising of interest rates, which coincided with all this, buzz and Ukraine, whatever else too, and just this anti-ESG movement, it all was a perfect storm, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take away from the impact Ukraine had. Suddenly there was a dramatic need for oil and gas, especially in Europe. And that fed into the forces that said, look, ESG is trying to destroy the oil and gas industry, which, some of the more extreme people on the protest side may have that as the goal. I actually believe that the oil and gas industry ultimately will become the new energy industry and renewable energy at some point. But that the Russia invasion created an oil shortage that fed the crisis, and that we're seeing politicians take advantage of to this day, even in the U.S. election.
It could be argued,
but the interest rates, to what your earlier point, James, I think most of it is really an interest rate story, and we saw, the companies that suffered are the companies with a lot of infrastructure, the solar, the wind. No better example than the electric vehicle companies, right? These companies were, suddenly they were going to build all these big plants and churn out hundreds of thousands of EVs. They just couldn't afford to make it work.
Yep. One thing I think we learned also with the Ukraine situation is how complicated energy markets are, and you could carry that analogy into economics writ large. In other words, there is a tremendous amount of public goodwill. I'm not talking about Wall Street firms that try to capitalize on ESG. I'm talking about regular people who want to do good. There's a massive movement for that. But economics are also very complicated. And you could argue that the public is still kind of learning. I'm looking at some stats here from, I forgot what this is, from a Forbes article that I wrote. I don't know where I got the stats, but 96% of Gen Zers say that businesses should be involved in solving social issues. And a Gartner survey showed that 74% of employees, of 30,000 employees, believe that companies should take stances on social issues not directly related to their business. Now, that gets contentious. I would argue, though, that especially as younger people, they mean well, but maybe they're still learning a little bit about the world, and maybe even older people too. Like, if I have a fair trade coffee business and you want to buy fair trade coffee, that's a fairly simple transaction to make, and it's win-win. But much of the world doesn't work like that. You want to avoid conflict diamonds. Well, guess what? Most conflict diamonds were used in electronics and other little things, not the kinds you buy at Mervis, right? I guess my question is, some voices, even on the left, say that ESG is just too complicated or too hard to have represented in business, and it just needs to be, in terms of social, actually, let's forget about ESG itself, but in terms of just do-gooder type efforts for companies, which the public clearly wants, can companies really do that? Or do we need the government to set those rules, and companies should only be optimizing around the rules the government sets?
Well, the problem with ESG is it was an attempt to bucket every good issue into one term, right?
Acronym,
And
yeah.
so
Which
that
doesn't
was
fit well
never gonna,
together naturally.
having run a company with 5 geographic locations in different countries, you're not going to be able to just have the head of ESG, force good through the company while everyone else is trying to do stuff. So it's, it ultimately it needed to be broken up, and it has been broken up in many of these companies. I think we do ourselves a disfavor when we try to sell the young people short. I do it every day. I look at people, my daughter and stuff, who are saying all the things you said, and they want to be better represented in their company and have their voices heard. And I'm like, look, you just get paid. That's what I did, and
I was happy just to have a job when I
yeah.
was at
But
college.
look, we are 4 years out from COVID, and remote work is still a thing, and folks are fighting it, but at some point these young folks are going to take over, and work is changing, and there's media companies. You and I, our friend Kevin Delaney from the Wall Street Journal, started this company Charter, which is focused on workplace issues, and very popular with the young. It just did a big deal with the FT this morning. That's why it's on my mind. The young, like it or not, however we like it or not, the way we worked is going to change, and maybe not the way that the young people ultimately think it will. They will learn some things about the world, as you say, but their momentum and their spirit is going to change things. And I think that positiveness and desire to be more environmentally friendly and less fossil fuel reliant is going to push through.
I like that. I like that spirit. And you could argue if everybody believes this. I mean, there are periods of time when everyone, or at least large portions of the population, had racist views, for example, or in Nazi Germany. Or, I mean, there are times when people believe certain things that we look back now and say, oh my gosh, that was very negative. I can't believe that happened. But yet we all, and if you were to try to discriminate, for example, now against someone in the workplace, it would just be a horrible thing. It'd be like the worst thing you could do. Whereas maybe 80 years ago, it was totally normal, right? Or very common, at least.
30 years ago.
Thank God for that. Exactly.
Yeah.
Thank God for that.
Yeah.
Thank God for that.
Yeah.
So, hopefully, as someone, we were just before recording, I'm an ice climber, and I barely had an ice climbing season this year, right? Because it's just too warm, pure and simple. And ski resorts are closing. It's just not, I know that the weather fluctuates, but the trend is very clear. Clear if you look at the data.
Yeah. I mean, look, things are changing. The world's changing, and the climate is changing. And the train that renewable energy is on is not going to stop. It will, gradually take over from fossil fuels to the point where, the energy markets will change, just as the tobacco markets have changed and the alcohol markets have changed. And we'll see where we are. We're never gonna, I don't think in our lifetimes, not have oil and gas, but we may have a lot more electric products. So and I think the markets will reflect that, and hopefully, change in the rate cycle will help. But the other thing is, I was talking to portfolio managers over the last couple of weeks, I'm like, what do we do? All these renewable energy companies are in the tank, even with the gains in the market this year. And they're like, we're looking at the companies that service them, right? We're looking at their
The picks
vendors.
and shovels. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what it is. So there's always a play out there. You just got to check it out.
So going back to markets, what do you make of the argument? I'm just trying to throw every anti-ESG argument I've heard
Yeah.
against you and
Yeah.
see what you think. That says, look, okay, so U.S., Europe, wherever else, let's say these good guys try to be nice and pay more and do things in a cleaner way. That just makes fossil fuels cheaper for the bad guys, the climate bad guys, China, Russia, India, whoever you want to put in that bucket, and they're going to gain an economic edge. Do you buy into that?
No, I don't, especially because the U.S. is still the largest exporter of oil
Good point.
in the world. I'm not too worried about that. I mean, China's moving faster on renewable energy than anyone. The case for renewable energy is not just because it's the right thing to do. It's actually cheaper to make and easier to use more of, especially if we can crack things like nuclear fusion. Um, and AI is only going to help that. So the energy markets will continue to change from oil to gas to shale to renewables to whatever. So I don't buy into that, and I particularly don't think that we can leave this in the hands of governments. Like you said, governments, what they're willing to pay or what are not willing to pay, the good guys, the bad guys. I think we've seen adequate evidence that governments are have been stymied by industry in any attempts to do something good, and stymied by geopolitical events such as Russia and Ukraine. So I think it's going to be up to the markets and entrepreneurs, and we happen to have a lot of those in this country. So that's why I'm still optimistic.
Great points. And speaking of governments, we're talking on the internet, which came out of a DARPA project. For years, I had a Tempur-Pedic bed, which came out of a NASA project years ago. There are critics who say the government should not be subsidizing via tax credits green energy so much, right? But then you could argue, many of our non-green energy related inventions have come out of the government in some way. What's the right level of government support? Do you think we need more of it?
I think the answer to that is the right level. We do need more of it, but the right level is the level that doesn't increase the debt and force changes to the rate markets. Right? That's we need to operate within a budget like all of our households do. But in general, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 has been a godsend for industry, and lots of companies are taking advantage of it in ways I don't think the government even expected when it passed the law. So I do think we need more of that, but it has to work in tandem with the markets, right? The government is just does not have enough money to build a renewable energy industry. It has to work with the markets.
Makes sense. Now, you mentioned the IRA, and it's obviously funneling a lot of money into green energy, and investors, regardless of their particular beliefs about net zero, about the climate, pay attention to that. Just turning to your newsletter, something I read you wrote in Callaway Climate Insights, solar accounted for almost half of new generating capacity in the U.S. last year, and was 67, of total new energy capacity handled by renewables. But you basically talk about how solar securities have been left behind in the toilet, victims of political squabbles. The iShares Clean Energy ETF is down roughly 30% over the past year. Obviously, solar is a part of that. If you were to play winners and losers over, let's say, a 5-year timeline, is solar at a point where it's attractive for some bottom fishing? Do you think it's got further to go? Like, what do you like and not like in this space?
The solar stocks and the other renewable clean energy stocks bounced in November and December when we thought rates were going to turn sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And then they continued to fall. I think they are very much a rate play. and probably not ready to rebound yet in terms of bottom fishing. Um, they had a great, those who remember the original clean energy boom in 2007 and 8, which was wrecked by the financial crisis. It took 10 years to build that back. It might take a little longer. It may not be these solar companies, right? It may be other types of new solar companies, more industrial solar companies, less residential solar companies. But the fact is that solar is booming, and whether China is going to own all of it or not, I don't think they will end up, but they're behind a lot of that growth right now. And solar, at using the energy, people who use it love it. So I think at some point the markets have to catch up to that. But something is holding these stocks back, and my sense is that it's the rate cycle.
Yeah, my dad got solar panels on his roof a couple of years ago, and it's become his hobby, like showing me screenshots from his app about how little money he's paying for his electricity versus me. So I think you're right. It is kind of a passion, at least for some people. You could argue though that solar's loss, that clean energy's loss over the past couple of years has been coal's gain. We have seen sort of a coal rebound over the next 10 years, though. Maybe over the next couple of years, that may still continue to be the case depending on rates. I agree with you. The rates are probably the swing variable. Over 10 years, 15 years, when do you think the tide really starts to shift? I mean, coal was almost dead before, now suddenly it's not. Is it going to die again for real?
I think it is, and I think more than any of the other old fossil fuels, coal's on its way out. It's the dirtiest of them all. It's the most physically unhealthy to humans. It's the one. It's the one that will go first when it goes, and it has had a rebound. So China is still building coal plants, right? So I think worldwide, even 10 years may be optimistic, but coal plants in the U.S. are closing at a fast rate, and that I think that'll happen sooner.
Gotcha. But it sounds like over the long run, you're obviously a believer. It's just a matter of when exactly that.
Yeah, and it's impossible to market time these things. Otherwise, we'd be a lot richer than we are. But it is just because ESG is a politically political lightning rod this election season doesn't mean that people aren't moving to cut their carbon footprints. Companies aren't moving to cut those, adapt renewable energy, and we're going to see more of that going forward.
I think so. I think, and just my own views, we're having a lot of growing pains with this, digesting a lot of very complicated issues, but there is fundamentally a core base of people who care quite a bit. And I'm a long-term optimist. And
yeah, look, when I was a young reporter in the 80s, I was covering the tobacco trials, and Philip Morris was by far the most successful stock of the 1980s. I mean, up 10,000. It was the Nvidia of its day. And I talked to fund managers, and one in particular, I remember saying, I'm like, why would you buy Philip Morris when the trend is down on cigarette smoking? And he said, well, it's not down that much. It's gone from 25% to 23% over the last 20 years. He's like, but Dave, there are 1 billion people in China who want to have a cigarette, and they'll just sell into those markets. And Philip Morris continued going strong for years. You don't hear much about it anymore. The things have changed completely in the last 30 years in terms of tobacco. And, I think they've changed in technology, as you and I have seen. They've changed in the internet, and they will change in the energy markets too.
Fingers crossed for that. Dave Callaway, always a pleasure to talk to you. If someone says, this is not enough, Dave Callaway, I want more, I'm guessing you would send them to CallawayClimateInsights.com. Is that the best place?
That's right. Every day of the week.
Every day of the week. Callaway Climate Insights. We'll put a note below the video as well. Dave, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. And thanks to you guys, as always, for watching us at home.